Alrighty, welcome to number 15, Discord Q&A. Let's get into it. Could Mel benefit from having her ultimate and W swapped like Neferi, Tom Kench, Diana were some of the examples this person was giving? So I'll give an immediate quick answer and then I'll get into some details. The short answer I think is it might be possible, but it would be significantly more difficult than any of the other examples, and I'm not sure that it actually solves Mel's problems, or that it would really like mitigate them in the way that I think a lot of people kind of believe. Because I think, to me, I've seen a lot of people talking about this. I've seen a lot of people suggest this, and I think a lot of people have this thought process of her W is the most frustrating thing about her. If her W is a longer cooldown, that would make her less frustrating. Those things might be true, right? But you have to consider all of the other things that you have to do in order to make the kit work when you move the W to the ultimate, which I spot a couple of problems immediately. Not saying they're unsolvable, right? I'm just saying that they're issues that you would need to resolve. Here's a couple of the bigger ones. Number one, what spell are you putting on her W? Because her current ultimate doesn't really make sense as a spell on your base kit. It's a damage multiplier, and without a long cooldown, it doesn't really make sense to say, oh, well, you get to blow up all of the stacks that you've applied to people. Okay, well, if that's on your base kit, then you're just going to do that in every single trade, right? You're just going to say, okay, I hit you with a Q, and I walked back 200 units, so you can't. Okay, I'm going to blow up the stacks. Oh, I hit you with the tip of an E, and that set up a few hits of my Q. Okay, I'm going to blow up the stacks, right? One of the things you might notice if you dig deeper into Neferi and Tom Kench especially, not Diana, I think she's a bit different than the others, but Neferi and Tom Kench is that the spells that we put on their base kits are really not their ultimates at all, right? Like, not their old ultimates at all, right? Like, the Tom Kench, the W that Tom Kench has today is really not his old ultimate in any meaningful way. It's a basically completely different spell. The old one was a semi-global teleport that could bring an ally along. The new one is really terrible Malphite ultimate, right? It's a combat spell that knocks people up, right? It's like actually a useful in combat spell, whereas the old one was purely a utility effect that would traverse the map for you. Similarly with Neferi, Neferi's old ultimate was out of combat steroid, makes you very durable. The new one is in combat, you need to use this well in order to get your durability, and also comes with a incidental steroid that suggests that you really should use it at some point. Kind of modeled more after something like Fizz's E, where it's like, oh, here's your defensive spell, but it's also a big part of your damage, so you're kind of encouraged to use it offensively. But there's situations where you get to use it defensively, and that's fun. And it puts some pressure on the player to figure out how they're going to sequence optimally, and that's really interesting to ask people. But that's not really very similar to the old one, where it's like, well, you just use this out of combat and you just go in, right? Like that's really all there was to it. And I think that's one of the problems that Mel is likely to run into, is like you pretty much need a new spell. Instead of the old ultimate, because I think the idea of like stack expunging is not very interesting here. It works okay for Twitch, though I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Twitch like auto into E is the most interesting pattern or anything like that. It works okay. And for a mage where that would be a core part of your pattern and that would be the core part of your gameplay, I don't think that would work. There's another large problem, which is, okay, what about the part where you have a purely defensive spell on your ultimate, right? I strongly suspect that what would end up happening here is, if we really decided that we wanted to do this, we would actually need some kind of offensive output for the reflect on the new ultimate reflect on Mel, because it's very hard to create a non-battle mage kit where your base kit is all of your damage. Right, look at every mage in existence, aside from battle mages, right? Don't look at Cassio, Rise type champions, right? But look at the actual mages in the game, right? Orianna, Syndra, Victor, Vhagar, name your favorite mage here. Their ultimates are always a core part of their damage pattern, because the core features of being a mage are that you're ranged and you are cooldown gated. And you get to do a lot of things on your base kit when those are your two, main, the main features of your, highlights of your class are, okay, so your cooldowns get to be really powerful because you're cooldown gated and you have range, right? And so if those two things are true, which we would want them to be true of Mel for sure, we enter into this situation where, okay, so let's suppose you want to kill someone. How are you going to go about doing that? The way we solve this on battle mages is we say, well, you're not really cooldown gated anymore, right? You have Rise QE, or you have Cassio E, or you have Swain Q. those kinds of spells, right? Like just spells that basically don't really have meaningful cooldowns, and that means that okay, well, your game plan is to try and get in range to cast this spell and not die, and if you get to do that, then eventually your opponent will die, right? When you look at champions like Orianna, Victor, Syndra, Veigar, etc., it's like okay, well, for most of the game, you need your ultimate to kill people, or that are at full HP, right? Sometimes you can pick someone off who's not full HP already, but you need your ultimate to kill people who are already at full HP, because if you don't need your ultimate to kill people, the question then becomes, okay, well then why are you a mage, right? Like in what way are you actually cooldown gated? And it's not to say we could never make a kit structure that would support this. We probably could, right? There's Echo as an example in the AP assassin space where it's like, well, yeah, Echo doesn't need his ultimate to kill people, but there's a lot of things on his kit that support that pattern, and Mel is not intentionally designed with that pattern in mind of like, oh, you're allowed to kill people with your base kit. And so, sure, we would probably try to solve both problems at the same time. We would probably give her a W spell that had a lot of variance on it, that would only situationally be useful for killing people, that would have a lot of gameplay around, okay, well, this spell was really, really powerful in this situation, but not as powerful in this other one, and maybe it would have a long cooldown as well for a basic ability. Who knows, right? But I think there's a number of issues that would make this much, much, much more difficult to do this process to Mel, even if it might alleviate some of the frustration of her kit. I think that the difficulty of doing this at all would be much, much, much higher than any of these champions named here. And one of the things I'll point out is that not all of these are created equal. I don't know why this just reloaded. We'll just scroll back down, I guess. Anyway, there's like if you think of a sliding scale from 1 to 10 of replace, the amount of work it requires to replace or to switch a spell and an ultimate on a kit, right? It's like, okay, 1 is very easy, right? And it's requires very minimal work. None of these champions are going to be 0, like literally nothing, right? But it's like it's going to require a very small amount of work. And then 10 is it's possible, but it is extremely difficult and requires almost as much work as like making 2 new spells, basically. Diana was like a 1 or a 2, right? You can look at Wild Rift's Diana as an example. You can see there's multiple different ways you can make the old Diana E into an ultimate. I think there's lots of different versions of that, and it really is, you don't have to change the old Diana ultimate at all. It's just, just make the damage a little lower, and that dash works fine as a spell on her base kit, right? Diana is the best example of the swapping an ultimate and as base kit spell, and it just being good for the character and not being very difficult, right? But then you start moving up to these other champions like Neferi and Tahm Kench. It's like, well, they basically, Neferi is maybe, like a 5 or something like that, where, they're, August had to put in a lot of work on figuring out exactly what are the properties of your steroid now, because it's not going to be an out of combat steroid button, right? It needs to be something in combat to match, the rest of the kit. And now you have this big dash on your ultimate. So like, how do you like reconcile all of those things that you've done? What other changes does the kit need? Et cetera, et cetera. And then Tahm Kench is probably a bit higher than that, where, again, the new spell is sort of vaguely similar in that, Tahm Kench channels for a bit and then he goes somewhere else. But it's a completely different spell, right? Instead of being an out-of-combat utility spell, it's now an in-combat, actual, like, crowd control spell, right? And that's, Tahm Kench probably ends up being like like a 7 on that scale, something like that. And I think Mel is probably way closer to being a 9 or a 10. And then the question also comes, I think, it wraps around to, okay, so maybe this would be an improvement, but number 1, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, is the improvement worth the costs that we're paying? Number 1. And number 2, is this actually where our efforts are best spent with Mel? Like, are there not other better ways that we could make her a less frustrating champion? And I think another question is, if we were to actually do this to Mel, does she still remain fun for Mel players? Because I think that a lot of the things that we would have to do, at least if someone, if I rolled into work on Monday and someone told me that I had to do this, a lot of the things that I would be doing, I think, or at least the ways that I can foresee this playing out, is a lot of the things that I would do to solve these problems that I've said, or that I've talked about here, would be making Mel more battle mage like. And the thing that I fear about that is that I suspect strongly that disenfranchises her current audience, right? there is definitely overlap between mage and battle mage players, right? Don't get me wrong, right? There's a lot of people enjoy both of them, but current Mel is much more on the burst mage uh, play style side of things, and that is pretty far from the battle mage play style, and I would be pretty concerned about disenfranchising her audience in order to solve the problems that would be result from doing this. But all of this having been said, I'm not an expert on the kit, right? This is something where if you could find a Misery, right, Mel's designer, and ask him about it, maybe he'd have different thoughts, different perspective. I'm not entirely sure. I suspect, kind of thinking it through now, I think the biggest problem you'd be likely to run into is what does the ultimate look like in a world where it's a primarily defensive spell? It probably needs some offensive output on it, but what does that look like? Like, what does a mage with a defensive output on their ultimate look like? And how do you make the base kit function in that world? And how do you make it so that the ultimate is an important part of their offensive output, or their important part of their ability to actually close kills on people? These are hard questions, right? And there might be good answers out there for them, right? It's not something I've thought super deeply about, but it's just I'm presenting some concerns to you, some potential issues with this. Not to say that it could never be done. Okay, would Lulu R tinify enemies match her fantasy? The answer to this question is yes, it would. However, this is one of those cases where I think it's a very, very, very cool suggestion, but I think it through in terms of the actual game design, like the actual gameplay of this, and I kind of question, okay, so what does Lulu R do when cast on enemies? Because I think it makes a lot of sense, right? From a fantasy perspective, yeah, Lulu is this sort of whimsical, there's sort of hints of this uh, impish, sort of mischievous, maybe malicious, sort of mystical creature, right? This Yordle who talks about tasting purple and can cast spells on her enemies and her allies, right? Two of her spells have different effects when cast on enemies versus allies, and then has a slow, Glitterlance thing. I don't know what that's all about, right? And it's like, okay, yeah, I could see a world, thematically speaking, where it makes sense. Wild growth when cast on enemies is wild shrink or whatever, right? Cool. Thematically speaking. But when I think about the gameplay, I say, okay, so Lulu already has Whimsy, and she can polymorph her enemies. She can disable them with a targeted spell for multiple seconds. And she already has a targeted nuke, a damage spell, right? That's what her E does, right? It just is targeted damage, and it also borderline guarantees that you're going to land Glitterlance as well afterwards. So then my question is, okay, so what's the output of ulting enemies? Because it probably can't be targeted CC, given that she already has polymorph on her kit. We're probably not giving a single champion multiple targeted CCs for enemies, right? Certainly not hard CCs. Is it a shrink that slows them? Does it deal damage, right? What are the incentives for casting the spell on enemies? Because if we're adding this, we would want it to actually be useful sometimes. We wouldn't want to just add a trap that's cool thematically that you should never use. So I struggle to see what the outputs of this are without significantly changing the outputs on Lulu's base kit, right? As an example, we could say actually the R is the polymorph, and then the W does something else when it's targeted on enemies or something like that. It's like, well, what is that? And is that actually good for Lulu's pattern that she feels much more pressured to W allies, because we'd be putting a lot of power budget into that probably, and the W on enemies probably wouldn't be able to be as good as polymorph, right? And would we want an ultimate level of power budget into polymorphing an enemy? Probably not, right? And so my immediate thought on this is mostly, I think that this thematically makes a lot of sense, but I'm not seeing what the gameplay would be to make this make sense without making significant changes to Lulu's base kit that I struggle to imagine what the upside of those are. And so it's like, okay, could it be cool? Sure. Is it something that I think is likely to be good for the game? Probably not, is the way that I look at that. All right. Any possibility for Radiant Virtue to come back to SR, tuned for tanks specifically, and less so supports? So when I think about Radiant Virtue, I think that there are two things I identified with Radiant Virtue that it was doing that were good for the tank system that I think could like the current system is lacking. Number one is a tank item for income tanks, right? Tanks that have money, that is a lot about a supportive output that you feel good about opting into, right? You're playing Maokai Jungle, you buy Radiant Virtue, and you feel good about team fighting with your team because you have a powerful team fighting item that is expensive and is hard for tank supports to get into, etc. Uh, that's I think that's a totally reasonable item that we could have, right? The team aspect of it. And I'll come back to this in a second. Let me talk about the second thing first. The other thing that I think makes a lot of sense as a tank, income tank item is a ult based item or windowed power item that says, I am really powerful in this moment, or I am really tanky in this moment, right? The ult Radiant Virtue said you gain a bunch of temporary health when you ultimate or when you cast your ultimate. Uh, it wasn't visualized very well. I think it would probably have been better as a shield, for example. But the idea that you are tankier when you cast your ultimate for a while makes a lot of sense to me, right? Hey, I want to, play Sejuani and be really tanky in that moment where I go, I initiate the team fight, or I want to be Malphite and I want to be really tanky when I initiate the team fight, whatever, right? All of that stuff makes sense to me. Those two things I think stand out as the two parts of Radiant Virtue that I think are positives that I would, not mind having in the current tank item system, and that I think actually would be good for the current income tank system. However, I have a number of issues with Radiant Virtue itself. Number one, I think the biggest issue with Radiant Virtue in and of itself is that I don't think that those two different things that I just talked about, the supportive item, as an income tank that you can go, that helps you, support your team, and the I ult and I go in. I don't think those items are supposed to be the same item. This is one of the consequences of the mythic system, where it's like every item needs to be doing 5 different things in order to accomplish all their goals, right? Like our items just became these these like masses of text, and every item is doing a bunch of different things so that it can accomplish all of the goals that it has, because it has to do so many different things in order to work in the mythic system. But those two things I just don't think are supposed to be on the same item, because most of the use case of I ult and I'm really tanky is you are solo frontline and you need to be the person to go in for your team, or you're solo frontline or you're the main initiator, and the value of that item is supposed to be, okay, you can succeed as a solo frontline or a solo initiator, or you can go in on your plays and not have to worry about having the support of your team exactly in order to make those plays function. Conversely, the supportive item of like I make my I buff up my team despite having income is sort of like the natural place for that to fit is, oh, well, my team has multiple frontliners, I don't need to be as tanky as possible. Because what you're sacrificing there, what you should be sacrificing there, is your own personal durability in order to give some of your power to your team, right? And so those two things being combined on the same item doesn't really make sense from a shape perspective. And that's personally one of the reasons why Radiant Virtue was one of the first items I removed when I was removing mythics from the game. I was like, yeah, this like these two things combined don't really make sense in a non-mythic world. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing about Radiant Virtue that's good, right? I think a lot of its individual constituent parts are good and could be added to the game. But I do have some particular issues with how it accomplished those goals, right? As an example, I think that the AoE drip healing is a pretty unsatisfying way of supporting your team, right? There are other things that we could do there, potentially like shielding your whole team, like Locket, right? Obviously, the reason why it's AoE healing over time was because it was trying to differentiate itself from Locket and Redemption, and that's totally reasonable, right? Especially because the original version was designed to, intended to be purchasable for supports as well. But I think ultimately, healing over time is less satisfying than burst healing, right? That's just a part of the human brain. Things that happen over time have to be, smaller values per activation, right? It's like, our heals over time in League generally are 4 times a second. You see +7 healing, even if that actually means, because that's triggering 12 times, it's actually a real amount of healing at the end of the effect. That's still just a pretty low value individually, and the human brain's not that good at recognizing those. Obviously, there are people that really like those types of effects, and that's fine, but that's just generally going to be less satisfying. And then the fact that it's AoE on top of that layers on another layer of lower satisfaction of like, here is my AoE healing over time item. multiple different ways in which an item is going to be less satisfying for most people. So that particular thing I take an issue with, of like, I don't think that exact mechanic makes the most sense for the tank item that is supportive for your team, or the income tank item that helps you support your team some way. But like I said, I think individual pieces of Radiant Virtue are pretty compelling. And all of this is like, I'll sum up all of this by saying, as I often say, is like, nothing's impossible. Could Radiant Virtue ever come back? Maybe, right? But I think in our current, at least in the current construction of the income tank system, it doesn't make that much sense as an item. And if I were working on that system today, one of the things that I would love to take a swing at, and like, oh, I'm trying to make new items for the income tank system, I would try both of those different things, like the I ult and I go in, and the I'm an income tank, but I want to support my team a little bit. I would try both of those as separate items, and I would probably start with pieces of Radiant Virtue, like the, hey, I'm the solo frontliner and I want to initiate, or I want to fight with, I want to frontline for my team. I would try ultimate, on ult you get a big shield, right? That would be my first stab at that, probably. And the support my team, I'd probably try some kind of AoE buff. I don't know if I wouldn't try AoE, healing over time, probably, but I'd probably try something in that space of like, oh, I ult and my team is stronger, or maybe not I ult and my team is stronger, because we already have Zeeks in that space for support tanks, and theoretically we'd have the durability item that I'm just talking about for income tanks. But some, under some conditions, I help my team out. Seems totally reasonable to me. Is Olaf supposed to be a light fighter like Fiora or Tryndamere, or a more durable one like Darius or Garen? So, this is one of the places where I personally really like my take on fighter class differentiation, rather than using the sort of more traditional like class groupings of like, the lighter fighters are skirmishers, and the heavier like the super heavy fighters are juggernauts, right? This is where I think there's a lot of value in having the sort of sliding scale that I like of, there's the heaviest fighters, which are champions like Darius and Garen, and then there's the lightest fighters of the Fioras, and the Rivens of the world. And then there's a sliding scale somewhere in the middle where most of the fighters exist in the heaviness range. And where I would put Olaf in that range is probably most of the way. Probably like, if you think of Garen and Darius are here, and all the way over here is Fiora and Riven, Olaf is probably somewhere over here, like probably 25% of the way up the entire scale away from Darius and Garen is where I think of him. Because most of the difference between these types of champions is what tools they have access to, and how much durability they actually need to they need to build to perform their function, right? You think of champions like Darius, it's like, well, he needs a lot of durability to function. He doesn't have any mobility. All he can do is walk at you in a straight line and try to hook you. Conversely, you look at like a Riven and a Fiora or whatever. It's like, well, these champions fly across your screen, or like have a lot of persistent mobility. They can stick to you. They don't need a lot of durability to function. They can just do their thing. Olaf also needs to walk at you in a straight line, but one of the critical differences between him and the actual, like what I would consider to be like true juggernauts, is number one, he has a range slow, and number two, he can be immune to CC, right? One of the most effective things against a Yorick, Darius, Set, etc., walking at you in a straight line is you can CC them. That doesn't work against Olaf some of the time, right? And he can also hit you with a ranged slow, such that he can actually catch up to you, right? And so a lot of the traditional counterplay against Juggernauts doesn't work on Olaf, which is why, while some people will call him a Juggernaut, I don't actually think that's a good way of thinking about the class differences between different fighters. Because while, yes, at the end of the day, he doesn't literally have a dash, he still does have to physically walk to you in order to hit you. He just has more tools in order to support him doing so than a Darius or a Garen or an Alawi or a Yorick or whatever, right? But he's obviously not nearly as good at doing, at getting to you as a Riven or a Jax who can just dash on you and just be on top of you instantaneously, right? Or a Camille is another good example of like a champion who has a like really I mean, Camille is like the best in class target access, right? She will get to her target if she wants to. And so that's sort of how I look at this question is Olaf is, by our technical class definitions, he sort of meets the definition of what a juggernaut is, but I don't really consider him to be a true juggernaut in the sense that he has to walk you in a straight line, but a lot of the things that are effective against other juggernaut, like what I would consider to be true juggernauts walking at you in a straight line, don't work on Olaf. And he has a much easier time doing that than those other champions because of his Q and his R, right? So this is one of the places where you look at the class definitions and you come to the conclusion these are useful for talking about champions, right? Like calling a champion a juggernaut or a skirmisher or a slayer or whatever version of the class system you're talking about. They can be useful for talking about things, but at the end of the day, champions are all unique and they all have different strengths and weaknesses, and they're not all going to fit in nice little boxes, right? You can say this is a juggernaut and this isn't a juggernaut. You can draw these hard lines, but at the end of the day, it's just, yeah, we have 170 some champions, and you're not going to be able to make nice boxes for every that perfectly fit every single champion in the entire game without getting a little messy, right? And that's why I like the sliding scale definition of how heavy is your fighter. And the answer is that Olaf is mostly like he is more towards the heavy side of fighters for sure. He is not a pure light fighter, but he is not all the way at the the full end of the heaviest fighters in the game, the Alawis and of the world, right? The Yoriks of the world, right? He's not them, right? Because obviously he has tools that they don't have, and he is allowed to ignore. He is lacking some of the same counterplay that those champions have, if that makes sense. Why are some rework champions drastically changed when some aren't? So a lot of this depends upon whether the champion is working for their audience or not, right? And what we think their audience can or should be, right? I'll use two really good examples here, I think, of what I would consider to be like fairly successful long-term, not necessarily saying immediately, but fairly successful long-term reworks and different approaches, right? Let's look at Aatrox versus Fiddlesticks, right? Aatrox, as an example, was a champion where he actually tended to rate really, really, really highly on our sentiment surveys and on our people identifying with his thematic or thinking his thematic is really, really cool, right? Like we had a lot of data to support that people thought that the way that Aatrox was sort of this originally like sort of vaguely villainous character, who was sort of vaguely like not necessarily confirmed to be, but like sort of vaguely evil, but talking about war and the sword guy who like actually is the sword and the body is is just a vessel. Like all this stuff was very cool for people, right? But the gameplay really didn't work for people, right? People would like this theme, try out the champion, and then say, no, this is not for me, or this sucks. I don't want to play this, right? And so they'd stop playing Aatrox, right? And so we had a lot of data, a lot of evidence to suggest not only was Aatrox not even really working for his audience that he had very well, right? Like the people who played Aatrox were not that happy with him up until the last couple of patches before he got VGU'd. Obviously, that part's a mistake, right? Like we should not have allowed Aatrox to be by far the most powerful champion in the game for several patches right before he got VGU'd. That led to some bad outcomes, right? But that mistake aside, the Aatrox that we had in the game was not working for the people that wanted to play him, or even for the people that were actively playing him very well, right? Like he was not working that well for them, right? And so the idea was, okay, let's come up with something new. Let's double down on his theme, make him an actual like world-ending villain. Double down on that, make him the great sword guy. That is all like his gameplay is all about this sword mechanic, right? Like the Q. That's what the whole kit is shaped around, right? And we made a very successful champion out of that, right? He's a very popular champion. And I think Aatrox, like obviously he required a lot of work, right? Because of his skill skew and his pro play issues, right? But we ended up with a really successful champion, right? That core hook of the Q gameplay loop works really well, and the doubling down on the theme to go even harder on the I am the supervillain, I am the world ender. That worked really well for Aatrox, right? And I think that put him in a good place, right? I think that Aatrox today, obviously he still has his problems around like builds and gameplay patterns and stuff like that, right? Like, don't get me wrong, he's not perfect by any means, but he's played by a lot of people, and the people who play him really like him. And I think that ended up working out pretty well. Conversely, let's look at Fiddlesticks, right? Fiddlesticks was working for the people who were playing him already, but was just really, really, really ugly and had some actual meaningful gameplay issues, right? Yeah, his Crow was pure RNG, so you just had complete random variance on whether your E was actually good or not in a lot of situations. Whether it was even worth casting in a lot of situations. He has a passive that's not that exciting to use. It's really invisible power, but it's not fun at all. It's just boring. And okay, so we upgrade the visuals again, double down on his theme. Push him up even more into this like unknowable, demon thing that is unclear, like exactly what or who he is. Right? Copies the sounds of his victims. Right? All again, doubling down on the theme and keeping a lot of the same gameplay that was already working for the people that were playing Fiddlesticks, but just upgrading it a bit and making it a bit more exciting, right? AoE drain. Oh, that's so cool. It makes a lot of sense for a jungler. You fear people that didn't see you. You have effigies now. You can play around these things. But the core loop of the kit around make sure you're out of vision and then ult people and then you get to drain them, that's the same, right? And that's that core gameplay loop was already working for Fiddlesticks players before, right? And that's the big difference with our rework slash VGUs is the core kit right now and the theme working for the people who are already playing the champion? Because if the answer to that is yes, we're much more likely to go for a smaller scale set of changes, things like Fiddlesticks or more recently Shyvana, comparatively to we redo the whole kit and we give you something completely new like an Aatrox or a Scion level of rework. And so that's the main difference, right? And so when you look at champions, you look at like Skarner, for example, and you say, well, why was he completely redone? It's like, well, because he wasn't really working for his audience and his theme didn't really work for anyone, right? Like he didn't really have a theme at all. He was sort of like Crystal Scorpion guy. Why is he the Crystal Scorpion guy? I don't know. Like, what does it being a Crystal Scorpion even mean? I'm not really clear on that, right? And I played a good amount of Skarner back in the day, right? It's like the theme didn't really work, and the gameplay wasn't particularly working for very many people either, right? He was the least picked champion in the game for good reasons, right? And so, while I don't think the current Skarner kit is good by any means, I think it made sense to go to shoot for let's redo the theme, pump this up, turn it up, crank the theming up. You are the Guardian of Ishtal, you're the Stone Scorpion, giant Scorpion guy now, and give you a completely new kit. Now, the completely new kit didn't really work out, obviously, but I think that the sort of motivation behind that made a lot of sense, and that's sort of the main dividing line here. And there are, like, to be clear, I've given you sort of a brief overview. There's a lot more nuance behind the scenes. This is something where if you want to hear more about this topic in depth, I recommend try and find August streaming and ask him about it. He has a lot more knowledge and understanding of this process than I do. But I'm giving you the sort of general sort of gist of why some champions get like a completely new kit and other champions get an upgraded slash enhanced version of their older, their previous kit. Is basically if your kit is currently working for your current audience, your kit's probably just going to get some tune-ups, some enhancements, and you're going to get new visuals. If your current kit is not working for the intended slash current audience, you're probably going to get a new kit, right? Like a Scion or a Puppy or Aatrox type VGU in that way. So that hopefully sums it up for you. How do you balance conditional abilities like Ahri's passive? So there's a couple of different ways I can interpret this. I'll give you a couple of different sort of perspectives on the answer. The first one is that it's really not like this is something where I think people have this impression that this is really difficult. It's like, oh well, it could give you 0 health or it could give you a lot of health. It's like, well, yeah, but we can often treat a lot of these conditional effects as if they're giving you the average, and that's a good way of sort of approximating how much power they end up being. There are cases where that doesn't work out, right? Like obviously there are versions of this where it's like, well, if 10% of the time this does nothing, and 10% of the time you win the game instantly, and then the other 80% of the time it gives you 1 AD or something. It's like, well, obviously that's not going to be that balanceable, right? But in most cases with these conditional passives, it's not that hard to tune them. It's like, yeah, Ahri passive is roughly equal to some amount of health regeneration based on how well you're last hitting, which does mean that people who last hit more, like better, and get more kills are going to do better on Ahri. It makes her more snowbally. It means she's a little bit more skill skewed. Okay, we can account for that, right? There's lots of things that are skill skewed on champions. There are lots of things that are snowbally on champions, right? Same thing with Katarina. You know what's good about Katarina? That makes her harder to play. She resets all her cooldowns when she kills someone, and so therefore, when you get ahead, you're likely to get more ahead, and that's part of why she's hard, right? But a good example from the past I've used before is when we were working on the Aatrox VGU. This was back when his E passive used to work on minions. The designer who was working on Aatrox, Jag, put in a buff. This was like, I don't know, like a month before we shipped or something like that. He put in a buff for the healing ratio that was quite large. And I remember, okay, because I was the one who was playing a lot of Aatrox top at the time, which there's more story to that. If you want to hear more about this, you feel free to ask the question, and we're going to get that in the Discord Q&A. But Aatrox, for most of his time when we were working the VGU, was actually being played as a jungler, so we were kind of scrambling towards the end to like tune him for top lane, which I think caused a lot of his problems. Anyway, I don't need to get into that. But anyway, so he put in this big buff for his healing, which would work on minions and champions. And I basically said, like, instinctively I read it and I was like, there's no way we can do that. We should not be doing that. It's going to be way too much healing. And so I said, okay, how do I prove that? Well, what I did was I calculated that once per wave, so every 30 seconds, you would Q the wave and you would hit your sweet spot on 3 minions. That was what I calculated. I said, okay, so this is how much you would heal every single minute if you did Q3 sweet spot of just, Q1, Q2, Q3 every 30 seconds on 3 minions, right? This is how much you'll heal. And then I translated that into how much health regeneration is that equal to? And then I translated that health regeneration into how much win rate would we expect that to be? And that ended up being something like 6% win rate. And I was like showcasing, I was like, look, Jag, look, man, I think that by all estimations, this is probably undershooting how much health you're going to be getting from the minions. And we would ballpark this at like 5 to 6% win rate worth of health regen. Like that's how much you're buffing him in terms of the healing on the E. And I think that was a pretty convincing argument because he immediately reverted the changes. Now, of course, right before we went to the PBE, he put them back in, so maybe it didn't work in long term. But I think it was that's the kind of thing where a lot of the time we have these conditional abilities. You can sort of translate the average case into something that you can vaguely understand. And I'm not saying like exactly this amount of health per minute is 5 to 6% win rate. It's like it was an estimation, right? We have rough estimations of like how much of each stat is worth, how much of how much win rate on different classes, right? Because it's not the same distributed amongst classes, right? Health regen is more win rate on a melee than a ranged champion, for example, right? But with a lot of estimations, we can get something that's sort of vaguely in the area of how much power is this, and with something like Ahri passive, we can vaguely estimate this is, in lane, this is roughly how much health regen it's worth, right? That's this much power. And the snowballing aspect of, Ahri passive triggering on champions is, well, yeah, she just gets to snowball harder. She gets stronger when she's killing people. Okay, that's easy to tune. That just means that she's better when she's getting ahead, and that might mean that if we want her to be less snowbally, we could reduce her ratios a little bit so that when she gets a lot of gold, she doesn't get as far ahead as other mages do. Or maybe we make her scale like the rank scaling on her last or second max ability slightly worse so that when she's getting really far ahead from getting kills, she doesn't have as much damage to kill people. Or maybe she gets less health per level because of this, and we say, actually, you need to kill people or you're a little bit less durable than other mages, or whatever, right? There's all sorts of ways that we can compensate for these effects depending on what we want out of the champion and how we want to balance them. But ultimately, my answer to this question is that it's really not that hard to balance conditional abilities. It just requires, kind of working around it a little bit. Is Sheen not able to be paired with high AD epic items slash components to control snowball potential? And this is specifically talking about Essence Reaver and in the low AD it has in its build path. The answer is actually just that Sheen is a lot of gold for a very minimal amount of stats. And you can see this in all of the Sheen items, basically, where they all either get a lot of stats for combining it or have wonky build paths, right? Like Trinity Force, like Dusk and Dawn is a great example of like, you get a lot of stats when you complete Dusk and Dawn, and the build path is really awkward. Part of the one of the main reasons for that is that 900 gold and all you're getting is 10 haste on Sheen itself leads to there being a lot of awkwardness around actually getting the full stats on the completed item, because we're typically not upgrading the Sheen effect by that much on the legendary. It's not like that's going to occupy a ton of the gold value. Like the Sheen is like Sheen itself is, just an expensive, not super powerful epic item. And so because of that, we end up in these situations where our Sheen items need to get a lot of stats when you combine them. And we don't have a lot of space in the build paths to give you the stats that the completed item will have, right? As an example, with Essence Reaver, it's like we want it to have a lot of AD, we want it to have a lot of haste, and it needs to have crit, right? And so it's like, okay, so the crit means it has to have a cloak. The AD means it needs to have some AD components, and we want it to have the rest of the haste in there. Basically, when I was looking at the build path for Essence Reaver, when I was making this version of it that we have in the game now, I was looking at it and saying, okay, there are two sort of clearly functional build paths. There's Sheen Pickaxe Cloak, Sheen Pickaxe Noon Quiver, or Sheen Caulfield's Warhammer Cloak, right? And I went with the Warhammer version of it because I felt that being able to buy two long swords was probably much a more functional version of the item for most of the users than the version where you have more AD in the build path because you can buy the pickaxe, right? But you can look at the combined cost on it. It's pretty low. And you can see because the Sheen is occupying 900 gold in the path, but not giving you that many stats, there's not a lot of room to give you a ton of AD in the build path because it needs to have crit. And again, this is the same problem that Dusk and Dawn runs into, where it's like, well, we need a lot of stats to build into this thing, and we don't really have a lot of places to, a lot of room to give that because Sheen is occupying so much of the space. And that's why the combined costs end up pretty low on these items typically, and that's why they end up getting a lot of stats when you finish them. It really has nothing to do with snowball potential or not being able to have a pickaxe or anything like that, or even like a BF sword. It's just those don't really fit because we want to have all of these different stats laddering into the Essence Reaver specifically, more so than anything else, right? This one isn't really a limitation or like an intentional, oh, we need to limit the power of this item. It's more, well, math is a thing that exists, and Sheen being 900 gold means that we occupy, for most items, somewhere around like 50% or like 30% of ish of the sort of gold value of the components of the item, right? Not like most legendaries are around 3,000 gold, so the 900 gold, and they also have a combined cost, right? So most legendaries are going to have somewhere around like 2,000 to 2,500 ish gold worth of components in them, or like constituent items that build into them, right? And so having a 900 gold component that only gives 10 haste really puts a damper on your ability to ladder stats super easily into the completed item, which again is the exact same problem I ran into with Dusk and Dawn, which is why the build path is super awkward with that one. So this one is not, really not it has to be this way because it can't have a ton of AD, but more it has to be this way because Sheen is an awkward epic item in the game. Why are Hail of Blades and Electrocute cooldowns so short? Well, first of all, I would actually disagree that Electrocute's cooldown is short. I think 20 seconds is quite long for a Keystone, actually, when a lot of them are actually permanent uptime, right? Think of something like Conqueror as an example, or like a PTA, or something along those lines, or even like a Lethal Tempo, right? We have a lot of Keystones that are just up all the time. And Hail of Blades cooldown is short, partially to differentiate it from the other domination runes, where it offers you a higher frequency of access, and that's one of the things that makes it different from the other domination keystones. But one of the other things that the reasons why it's a lower cooldown is that Hail of Blades doesn't just ask you to combo someone with your spells and then get your value and leave immediately, right? It says, hey, you need to attack them and then also attack them 3 more times. Yes, it gives you a lot of attack speed with which to do that, but it's not like that's something that's a free action that you get. It's asking you to do something extra on top of the things that you were already doing, right? Most of the champions that actually take electrocute can trigger it in less than a second, right? Whereas even if you already have attack speed, actually getting all of your Hail of Blades attacks off takes a while, right? It takes you standing still and actually attacking your opponent 3 times to get those Hail of Blades autos off. Maybe more if you have attack resets, if you're, a Vi or someone like that, right? And so part of the reason why the cooldown can be fairly low on Hail of Blades is that there's going to be a lot of situations where you trigger Hail of Blades and you don't get those 3 autos off, and it just goes on cooldown without doing the full effect or without doing that much. Whereas conversely, electrocute, whenever you trigger it, you're always getting the value from it. You're getting the full damage, right? And so then it goes on cooldown, and it's like, okay, well, you fully got the thing off, right? I think this would be a little different if, say, for example, Hail of Blades only went on cooldown when you actually got all 3 autos off. That would be a bit of a different take on the Keystone, and that one would probably need to have a longer cooldown because you would be able to keep that attack speed. It would be available when you needed it much more frequently, and so therefore the cooldown would need to be longer. But because there's gating on getting value from Hail of Blades, and you're not guaranteed to always get value out of it when it triggers, that is a big part of why the cooldown gets to be shorter than the other Domination Keystones. But all of this having been said, part of the reasons why Electrocute's cooldown is like, it could be 60 seconds, right? Or, the original cooldown Electrocute was like 40 seconds or something like that back when Runes of Forge first launched. The reason why we lowered the cooldown from being super, super, super long is twofold. Number one is the amount of power that it has to have when it's a really, really long cooldown like that, like 40 seconds, like, much longer and, much spikier. Then a power that it has to carry is really, really crazy eye-popping damage, right? It has to do some really insano damage if you don't have a keystone for 40 seconds or whatever it was when it's on cooldown. It has to do some things that are really, really shocking and I think probably not healthy for the pattern of some of these champions. That's one. And number two, it ends up being very, 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 very jungle skewed, where laners have a hard time getting value out of Electrocute because they trade pretty frequently. But for a jungler, they don't care that the cooldown is 40 seconds. They're only going to interact with someone, roughly once every minute in the early parts of the game, right? And so the cooldown being super long doesn't affect them at all. And so they get all of the benefit of it having really, really high damage without having any of the downside of the cooldown being longer. And so one of the ways, that we buffed Electrocute for laners specifically, and also made it so that it didn't have to do crazy eye-popping damage that was really shocking and potentially kind of unhealthy, was to lower the cooldown and lower the damage such that you could access it a bit more frequently, but it wouldn't have to do absolutely ridiculous damage when you actually did trigger it, which I think ended up being very healthy, very good for the rune overall. And so I'm actually pretty happy with where the cooldown is right now. Why do champions like Mbessa and Zehen get free armor pen on their R passives? So let's do a little bit of a history lesson here to explain where this came from, how this came to be, and where we are today. And kind of this is going to be a longer answer. I'll tell you that right now. So this originally came from Pantheon. Phlox was doing some work on Pantheon to unsupport skew him, because not only back in the day was Pantheon more popular as a support, back then before his changes, but he was actually more powerful there. And so we were limited in our ability to buff Pantheon in solo lanes, particularly Pantheon top, because we couldn't make support too much more powerful, right? And so we set up this entire project, which Phlox did, in order to make him more powerful in the solo lanes. On live right now, support is still more popular. It's his most popular individual role. I think it's like 34% of his plays or something like that. But his pick rate is split amongst other roles actually pretty reasonably, such that it's not like support is the only way you can play Pantheon. And he is more powerful in solo lanes today than he is in support, which is good because that's pretty important that you can actually feel like you can play him and be a carry. But anyway, a lot of this came from Phlox basically looking for ways to give Pantheon a couple of properties that he needed, right? Number one was he wanted Pantheon to be able to interact with tankier, more durable champions in a side lane later on in the game, which was something he had a problem with at the time, right? And that was something that discouraged people from playing Pantheon top, was that outside of the early laning phase, once people got some armor, it was really hard for you to interact with them. Okay, armor pen helps do that. Secondarily, it gave him experience scaling. It said, hey, getting a lot of levels and staying in your lane and having a lot of XP is powerful, because when you put points into your ultimate, you actually get combat power. Whereas in the previous versions of Pantheon, who cared, right? Like once you hit level 9, you max your Q out. The rest of the points that you would put into your spells wasn't really doing a whole lot for you, right? So it gave him a bunch of properties that helped skew him more towards solo lanes, like damage scaling, especially against durable targets, experience scaling, and just generally rewarding higher damage builds, like rewarding, give you gold scaling essentially because your damage deals more damage, based on your AD because you get to ignore a percentage of your opponent's armor, right? So it gave him a lot of properties that really helped him be less powerful in support and relatively more powerful in the carry roles where you were getting gold. And that was really important for Pantheon, right? Now, fast forward a bit to the durability patch. Suddenly, everyone has more armor per level, right? Even some of the 80 carries out there have nearly 100 armor at level 18, right? There's a lot more armor in the game, and so this percent penetration becomes a lot more powerful innately, right? And then fast forward again to Mbessa development. Okay, so Mbessa development, there's I think there's been a lot of talk of the actual process, by people like Yellow online. You can find probably some interviews I think that were done with him, talking through like, hey, this is how, this is the different problems we had, or these are the different stages we went through with Mbessa development. But the reason the armor penetration was added to Mbessa's ultimate was at the time in development, we had two sort of big problems with Mbessa. Number one was that she was not sufficiently uh, able to interact with durable targets, right? She felt like she was unable to interact with anyone who purchased armor or anyone who was like meaningfully, like indexing into durability, which meant that she wasn't a top laner, right? And we were trying to push her more towards top, right? There were versions of her where we were maybe okay with her being a mid laner or a jungler, but at this point, we decided, hey, we want her to be more like a top laner, and if you're a top laner, you have to be able to interact with more durable targets, or you're just not going to work, right? So that was one big thing. Another thing was she was too sharp, right? And what I mean by too sharp in this context was she was too good at bursting squishies, and we didn't have good ways of tuning that on the kit at the time. And so I think it was a pretty, at the time, I think a pretty reasonable thing to say, hey, well, actually, we could unsharpen her and give her some tools to actually be able to hit these more durable targets by giving her this percent penetration that Pantheon has, because that will make her do more damage. We can nerf the base, nerf the damage on the base kit and say, okay, you do more damage based on how much armor your opponent has, right? That's essentially what percent penetration passively is doing, is saying, hey, here's some damage amp because everyone has some armor, and it'll be more effective damage amp against people who have a lot of armor, right? And so we ended up in this place where we said, okay, in order to make her a little bit less in need of, like, a little bit less desperate to only dive backline every single combat, like only one-shot backline in every single combat, we will give her this percent penetration so that it's easier for her to lane top lane, especially side lane later on in the game. She doesn't feel as in need of buying percent penetration, because that was another concern that Yellow had at the time when we were working on Mbessa, because he didn't want her to build big health items like Cleaver, and he also wasn't sure he could get her to buy Cyrilda's Grudge, right? That would actually fit into the build, right? His ideal, build was like, the caster fighter items, right? Things like Eclipse and things like Death's Dance, and hey, things like Endless Hunger today as well. Though of course that item wouldn't exist for a while. But the idea was that he wasn't sure he could actually get her to fit percent pen into her build, but he wanted the properties that would bring, and so giving her that passive percent penetration would enable the patterns that he wanted, like that we wanted out of Mbessa at the time. Now, I will say, I think a couple of things did change along the way that I think maybe made it so that potentially this wasn't necessarily the right solution at the end of the day, right? One of the things I think that we did that was really big for Mbessa was we said, hey, your ultimate is now a lot more reliable, right? For most of development, Mbessa's ultimate was a lot less reliable. And so, of course, her feeling like she had to go for the squishy backliners felt really bad. And it felt like she needed the ability to interact with the front line because she didn't have the ability to get on the backline with any level of reliability at all, right? And so, of course, we felt like we had to give her tools to interact with frontline. But now, because we made her ult more reliable, I actually question whether she needs powerful tools to deal with, interact with the frontline, because she can often get to the backline anyway, and even with her current shape of kit, she's generally really successful and happiest when she's doing that, and she has the tools to do so. And so then I think that leads itself to the question like, okay, well, do we want this mechanic if it's, you know, if it's actually just giving her a capability that she doesn't even need to use? Is that a positive for her? Obviously, the part where it puts her, you know, it shifts her towards top because it makes her better at dealing with more durable targets, I think that's part's a positive. But I think it is worth asking the question, like, is this actually something that we really still truly need on the kit or truly want on the kit? Because some of the foundational assumptions around the way that she has to play, like team fights and skirmishes, are not correct anymore because her ultimate is just a much better spell now, and she has a much easier time actually accessing the backline. So that might not necessarily work out anymore. Zehen is a little bit of a different case. I'm not as familiar with Zehen. I just wasn't as involved in Zehen's development. I'm not as familiar with all of the problem statements, but I believe the main motivation for the percent penetration on Zehen Ultimate was very similar to the play pattern stuff on Mbessa, where it was, hey, we're asking Zehen to hit someone for a long time to get his passive stacked, but when he fights squishies, he kills them so fast that he can't even stack his passive if he's tuned correctly. Therefore, what we need to do is we need to give him some output that is good against the more durable frontliners, so he feels good about fighting them in ways that he can build up his passive, and then that enables us to actually lower his damage sum against the squishier targets, so that he doesn't kill them, you know, burst them instantly and feel like he always has to go for a, you know, WR onto the backline in every single fight in order to succeed, right? It was in order to encourage the play patterns that we wanted. Now, all of this stuff having been said, I personally really dislike these effects. I think that they are generally negatives for the game, and I would much, much, much rather give these champions shreds, right, on their kit somewhere, right? As an example, Mbessa could say, everyone in my R line gets shredded for 30% for 4 seconds or whatever. Or my E shreds for 30%, you know, while you're slowed. Or maybe even longer than you're slowed. Maybe it's for 4 seconds. Maybe it's for 5 seconds, right? Who cares? And Zehen could have a shred on his E, right? Or on his Q, right? Like looking at some of our existing champions that I think have similar targeting incentives, right? Look at like Wukong and Jarvan as examples. Their shreds, I think, actually work really well for these purposes, but they don't have a lot of the negative consequences. And in particular, it makes it so that these champions don't just have the ability to free, like, checkmate tanks without building to do that, right? Like, which I think is upside, right? Because I think one of the concerns I have with having a lot of, you know, especially passive percent penetration in the game that has no real gating on it, is that it lends itself to situations where building armor is no longer effective. And I think it's actually pretty important for the game that building armor actually does something, not just for tanks, though I think that's obviously important, but also for squishies, right? I think that if you are a squishy, you know, you're an AD carry and you build a GA, I believe that the armor on that item is supposed to do something, right? And that's one of the problems with allowing some of these percent penetration effects is like, well, yeah, Zehen can also go Black Cleaver. You know, so can Mbessa, and Mbessa can also get a Serilda's. So can, you know, so can Pantheon, right? And these champions can basically get to the point where armor is no longer effective against them because they're penetrating over 50% of your armor, right? And we're getting into these situations where they have ungated access to ignoring over half of your armor, which basically means that armor means nothing against them, which means that a lot of our systemic interactions and solves for certain types of interactions just stop working. It's like, oh, only the passive on GA matters because the armor in and of itself isn't going to do anything for you, right? And that kind of breaks a lot of our systems where items like Death Stance, for example, become a lot less effective for a champion like an Aatrox or a Riven or a Red Kayn or whatever, because, yeah, that armor doesn't do anything against the really strong, you know, Mbessa or Zehen or whatever, right? Because he's just going to ignore most of it. And that kind of breaks a lot of the intended systems here. This is not saying that armor has to be uncounterable, right? It is pretty important. I think that there is percent pen and percent shred in the game. I just think that persistent, like powerful stacking of these effects that has very high or 100% uptime, I generally believe is a negative for the game because it means that buying armor becomes very ineffective. And there's a big difference between armor is not as good at 35 minutes as it is at 15 minutes, and armor is completely ineffective at 35 minutes comparatively to being effective at 15 minutes, right? Because it's important that armor does get outscaled, like that resistances in general get outscaled, because we need damage to outpace durability because we want the games to actually end. We want player actions to actually end games. And so we don't want people stalemating the game very easily. by like just having a really strong frontliner that tanks forever. But there's a difference between armor gets worse over game time, or resistances get, and health get worse over game time, and they are ineffective over game time. And I do think that these percent penetration on our passives do trend themselves towards resistances feeling like they're just ineffective later in the game, especially more so than anything else, which is my kind of summary of my thoughts on this matter in general. Will we ever have size decrease as a stat similar to size increase? We actually already do on like Trundle ult, and I think a couple of other areas. On top of this, of course, I'm sure I've seen a lot of people talking about this because of the shrink engine augment in ARAM Mayhem. But we already have this on a few effects, and I wouldn't be surprised if we had it in small areas in the future, similarly to how we use size increase. Like, yeah, there are some champions that get bigger over time or get bigger under certain conditions, right? Like Lulu ult or whatever. Yeah, I don't think it would be unreasonable for us to have a couple more places like this, right? I mean, depending on what you mean by size decrease, right? We already have this in more than one area. But like, for example, Lulu's polymorph also makes you smaller, right? And so on and so forth. But the answer to this is basically like, yeah, we kind of already do. Could we use it more? Yeah, probably. Like, we probably could. But I don't think it's super likely we'll suddenly see like a bunch of this on items, for example, because I just don't think it makes a ton of sense on most items. Like maybe there could be one item that does this a little bit, but in general, we have size decreases in the game. Will we have more? Maybe. Could happen. All right. The final question for today. Untying Irelia and Blade of the Rune King. How would this be done? So I think there's a number of different ways. This is something I've talked about in previous Q&As. If you've listened to the previous ones, I'm sure you've probably heard me talk about this. I think probably more than once. Yeah, Irelia is probably an example of a champion where she might be too heavily tied to an item and feel too dysfunctional pre-Bork. And if you try to go for a non-Bork build, and especially because she's tied to it in a way that I actually don't think feels like super compelling for Irelia players, where it's like, oh, I have to buy this in order to hit wave clear, like in order to hit Q reset breakpoints, or I have to buy this in order to actually be able to fight people. But it makes me particularly good at hitting like high health targets in ways that maybe aren't appropriate for the champion, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Don't need to get into that all that whole thing, but how would it be done? I think the answer is there's a number of different ways that you could do it depending on what you want Irelia to be. Do you want Irelia to be more of a basic attacker? Do you want her to index into other on-hit items? Do you want Irelia to be more of a caster? And in that situation, it's like it might be a world where, hey, we actually put an on-hit mod on her Q and give it more damage and maybe a higher AD ratio, and give a higher AD ratio on her W, and maybe put an AD ratio on her E, and maybe lower the W and E cooldowns a little bit, and she's now a caster, and she is more about hitting her E and like absolutely popping off when you hit the E into the fully charged W or something like that. Do we want her to be a caster? Do we want her to be more Jax-like and have a much lower cooldown on her Q that she's allowed to repeat cast on people over and over again, more like the older Irelia, right? Like the pre-VGU one. Of course, I think the problem with that one is like, do you still have the reset in that world? Because the E reset marks from E and R are, part of the reason why they're allowed to be there is that your Q cooldown isn't super low like the old pre-VGU Irelia was, where she could keep, casting Q on you over and over again. Anyway, but I think the first step in saying, like, determining how you would untie Irelia and Blade of the Rune King is, what do you want Irelia to be? Right? Like, what version of Irelia do you want? And this is something where I don't think there's a clear consensus on this internally of what we want, like what the vision for Irelia as a champion is. Like, who is she? Like, how does she win games? What do we want that to be? Is not clear to me personally. I don't personally have a super strong opinion on this. This is one of the cases where it's like, well, if we really wanted to spin up work on this and someone had a really strong opinion and they said, hey, look, I believe Irelia should be ABC, and this, and I have reasons XYZ why I believe that Irelia is supposed to be a caster or a auto attacker or something else, right? I personally don't feel super strongly about exactly what Irelia is supposed to do, is supposed to be, and so that's the first step in determining how you're breaking this synergy is determining where Aurelia's, like what Aurelia is supposed to do, how she's supposed to win, what her success conditions are supposed to be, right? Using the caster example here, if we said, we want Irelia to be a caster champion. We want her to be more like a Riven, right? Or more like the previous version of Irelia, or I guess not necessarily the previous version. There are some ways in which the previous one was more castery, but we want her to be more Riven-like, more Aatrox-like. Like I said, that probably involves lowering her cooldowns. That probably involves her Q either not applying on hits at all, or not applying them at full effect, or having a longer cooldown and more of her power being loaded into her W and her E and potentially even her R. Maybe less power in the passive, and or maybe the passive also empowers your spells, right? Things like that basically make her more spell centric, and innately making her more spell centric, especially if you unbind her from some of her attack speed synergy, is going to make Blade of the Rune King less good. I think there are all sorts of smaller things you could do. One of the things that I've suggested before is, yeah, I don't actually think that Aurelia's bonus damage on her Q that deals extra damage to minions is supposed to trigger lifesteal, right? That's one thing we could do to nerf Blade of the Rune King just sort of on its own. That does have implications on what she builds, but doesn't necessarily require a super strong direction on, oh, this is the the version of Irelia that we want to be in the game, or this is the way that we want Irelia to win, or the way that we want Irelia to lose. But there's all sorts of different directions we could take in this space. But if we're looking for sort of directionless versions of just how do we make Irelia less tied to Bork, I think reducing lifesteal synergy by doing the thing I was just talking about of removing, like making it so that the bonus damage to minions on Q doesn't trigger lifesteal, that would be one thing. I think buffing the bonus damage to minions such that you don't need a specific, like any specific items or a specific AD breakpoints or whatever in order to one-shot backline at a given level. That would be another way we could reduce the Bork synergy, which doesn't have a crazy, I mean, it has some implications on her builds, obviously, but it doesn't have super hefty implications on like how she's winning, how she's playing. Those are two that come to my mind immediately. But ultimately, I think if someone were taking a crack at this, I suspect that they would need to start foundationally by saying, this is what I believe Irelia is supposed to do. This is how I believe that she's supposed to play, and this is why. And I don't have that for you, right? Like, and that's sort of why I haven't tried to do work on Irelia, right? Is I don't have a super strong foundational opinion of like, this is what I believe she should be. This is what she is. This is what she should be, and this is how we're going to, get there from here. That's sort of where I'm at least. And there are some people internally that have strong opinions. Some people disagree about what exactly she should be, what she could be, etc. But it's an interesting champion. It's an interesting problem case. But yeah, this is going to be it for Discord Q&A number 15. So hopefully you enjoyed it. And as usual, thanks for watching and catch you next time.